Thank you guys so much. All right. So on the Commit Your Code website, it was going to be talk about React accessibility, but I changed the talk. So sorry if you were here for that. But we're going to be talking about automation systems with NestJS. So NestJS is a backend JavaScript framework that we can use to really organize and modularize our code. So if you want to go ahead, for those people, my lovely folks on the stream, if you want to go ahead and scan that or whatever, we'll start with the talk. So, all right. So the overview of concepts is just one of the things is briefly talk about automation. And so really, this talk stems from one of the first responsibilities I had as a software engineer in my current role was to automate some processes that involved a lot of human interaction. So basically, we had a lot of we had processing data that a lot of people had to touch, and so my first task was to eliminate that need for the human person to touch it, right? But don't worry, those people still had jobs. Doesn't mean anything. It just got reallocated somewhere, right? So yeah, the topic of automation is just how do we use code? How do we use software to make things go from point A to point B with as little human interaction as possible? So the role of JavaScript, well, this is a JavaScript talk. And so at the time, I came in as a front-end developer, and I didn't know any back-end languages, like the traditional ones, Java, Python, C#, really well to really grab my teeth on this goal, this problem. So I was like, what can I do with JavaScript that can still give me that ability to organize my code and really be efficient with it? So there is where NestJS comes in. And it really follows the OOP, the MVC pattern that you see in a lot of these other frameworks. I'm talking Java, Spring Boot, or the .NET framework in C#. This kind of does it, but in JavaScript. So I'll show you throughout the presentation, I'll show you guys some examples, and then what we did to solve this problem of automation, which is really cool because it was kind of out of the box, something that I'd never really done before. So, all right. So I wanted to make this a little fun, I guess. So I have to think about it in terms of the context, right? So our friend Bob, our client Bob, has decided that he needs to automate his contracts. So basically, he runs a small construction business. If you don't know who this is Bob the Builder. And he's overwhelmed. So the guy is too busy constructing things and running a cartoon show. So he comes to me, and he wants to automate incoming contracts. So clients that want to use his services to do his work, right? But he needs to reduce that time because he doesn't have anyone to help him. So the solution that I proposed, which is kind of similar to what I did actually in real life, was to take Bob's current CRM. So he had a primary data source of people that went in and imported contracts or filled out forms, anything that got the data into Bob's system. He already had that, so we are not going to mess with that really, if anything. But the rest of the tools that we did are things that we are going to add to his current infrastructure. So the first thing is MongoDB as the intermediary database, but really this can be anything. This is the one that I did because there's examples in this that are specific to MongoDB, but I'm sure they all exist in SQL as well. We have the RPA tools, so specifically robotic process automation. It's just browser automation. Let's say there is a process that needs to be accomplished, but there is no API for whatever reason. You could, in theory, repurpose like Playwright, Selenium, tools that would be used for QA. You could repurpose those to run in an isolated environment for automation. But the first two, UiPath and Power Automate, are really the ones that I think of with automation. But other than that, that's pretty much all we need to worry about. And then the thing that we actually are talking about today is NestJS, which is the central server that is going to handle all of these different talks. So the bottom diagram that we have is essentially what, at every stopping point, every arrow going from one box to another to the diamond, there was an interaction that required someone to actually physically check the contract for whatever, right? So Bob wants to automate all of that. And so with these tools, we are going to do just that. So I'll talk a little bit about architecture. Again, we have the three databases, or the three touch points. We have the primary data source. We have the intermediary database. I can't say that word today. And we have the automation tooling. And so basically, if you going back to the diagram, it's going to go from Bob's CRM. We're going to do some things. And we're going to write it right back, right? So now, NestJS. Let's talk about a little bit about NestJS. So I mentioned the modularity that you can do with NestJS. You can organize things into modules. You can organize code. You can organize functions. You can do all that in modules to keep code as clean and concise and reusable. It supports solid. So when you go on the NestJS website, they really talk about that. Just having those principles really laid out within the framework, and really. At first I saw that and I was like, okay, well, this is great. Let's work with it. But as I started to develop, my love for backend increased. But also, I was thinking in terms of if I were to leave this project and give it to another developer who may be more backend heavy, who may come from a Java or C# background, I wanted to make sure that they had that ability to pick up where we left off. And the only difference really would be that it's in TypeScript, right? And it's just syntax is a little different, but otherwise it's still the same ideas. So separation of concerns. So let's say, for instance, Bob wants to extend his needs. He has another problem, and we need to somehow improve on one side of the system without messing with anything else. And that's really where NestJS can be beneficial, because then we also are thinking in terms of separating things, much like MVC, much like separation of concerns, and making sure that we are not breaking things as we're trying to fix other things. So now we'll get started with like how it looks like in NestJS, right? So schema. So Bob has contracts that come in, and they all have different entities. Ooh, that's pretty small, but and it has different attributes, entities. It has status, it has the customer name. Just know that that's how we define our data, and we make sure that it is clear and concise as at every point that we have a contract come in, right? The login info, if you guys can see that, it's really for the automation tool. So in the event that for some reason then you needed a login or something, you could store that. Obviously, security is a big concern there, because then you don't want to be storing credentials there. But again, that's one of the things that you could do to add to that automation for the browsers. All right, so let's talk about how to set up modules in NestJS. So really, if you look at the diagram, we have the root, and we have all these other wonderful JavaScript specific files that you see. But then in the source file is really where things start to divide up, right? So we have the contracts. So you see that right there. I have the contracts directory. I'll say directory, but really that's the module. That's where you're going to put all your things pertaining to the contract in the situation, or really any module you have. You put all the specific tools that you need, or the specific code that is pertaining to that, to separate it. Then we'll see in a little bit, we have the app module, which is the global thing. That's where you import all your modules so that things can work, right? Let's see. All right, so we're starting with the contract module, because then we're trying to help Bob out. And if you, when we look at the contract module, you'll see it's decorated. Again, if you come from a Java or a C# background, this will kind of look familiar in the sense of like you'll see like the @ and then whatever import you're trying to use, or whatever function you try to use, method. So yeah, other than that, it's pretty simple. It's pretty straightforward. You have the imports. I use type ORM. I did that just to use an ORM. It's a little more, it's still JavaScript, and you can use so many different packages you can do. You can still run things like you would in an Express app or any other framework. for Node.js. But this just kind of makes it really clear for you. So I use type ORM, and then the providers you'll see is a service file, which we'll get into in a little bit. And then you export the class. Now, let's say I want to put in a database, so I'm going to use the MongoDB piece, right? So I will grab, specifically, I'll grab the ORM of my choosing, or MongoDB has a great Node.js driver. It's super awesome. So you could also put that in here as well. But it's kind of where you put your config for your database, and you do all those other things that you have to put in. And then the entities, which is the contract the model that we just had, we also put that in there as well. Now this is the app. This is the global module that we have that is at the root, essentially as close to the root of the project. And that's where we put in everything. So I see there's the database module that we just went through. We have the contracts module. And then we have a config module that we need to use for, I want to say it was for type ORM as well as the entity as well. And then the app controller, the app service. And so when you route, the app controller would be the route of the URL, right? So whatever you want to put there, it's really great. You can put that in there. We'll talk more about that too with when you start up. If you want to, we'll get more into it. But as you start, if there's an action that you want to have at the beginning of the starting of the server, you put that in the app module files, whatever you need to put in. So now we have the controller and the service layers. So again, if you have seen that before, you've seen controller, you set up your endpoints. I'm talking REST here. And then the service files, you will put in your logic, whatever you need to put in to make your endpoint do whatever it has to do, return whatever it has to do. You have dependency injection. We'll go into that a little bit as well. You can export, you export certain service files. You can start putting in service logic into different modules. I had to do that because I know at one point you may have something that's really good and really set up in one module, but then you may need to use it for a different controller. And for that, you do that, right? DTOs. So we're going to add, we'll talk a little bit about that in the next slide. And then, again, you have your business logic. So, all right. So now, first thing is Bob wants us to have a contracts module or a contracts endpoint, so that way we can put in our specific contract data that he wants. So he wants to get a route that is a GET request to receive all contracts. Whatever reason, that's what Bob wants, that's what we're going to get, right? So you see I injected the module, so at the constructor. Again, this looks very familiar, right? If you come from a C# background and the Java background, it's like this looks very familiar. Like, okay, I know where things are happening, right? And then I bring in the repository of the contracts so that I can get all that information. And then this specific line here, the contracts query, which is just finding all the contracts. Just something that you can happen in database in the ORM of your choosing. They may all be different, but it's all essentially the same thing, right? And then he's like, oh, I just want you to return that. When I hit this endpoint, I get all these contracts. Now, in our entity, there may be some fields that we don't want to have, right? So with that, we create a data transfer object so that we can shape the data that we want to return whenever you visit the endpoints. So for this specific thing, Bob wanted the customer order number. He wanted to see the name. He wanted to see the status, so if it had been accomplished or not, or any other status that he may want, and the email. Wanted that readily available. And so we wrote him exactly that. So we wrote some logic in that endpoint to fetch all the contracts and then return the data transfer object. And so you see that there. So now, let's go back to this. So now this would be great, but let's say for whatever reason we needed to reuse this code, this same idea for something else, something different. It could be anything you can think of. You could just go ahead and just copy and paste this. Like, I know, like, it's pretty simple to just copy it and then put it in another endpoint or whatever. But then all of a sudden, what if something changes? then it's like, okay, well, now I got to go back and change every other point of every other bit of logic, every other function that I did, and that's not reusable. That's not maintainable, right? It's gonna get really poorly. It's just gonna suck. It's gonna suck. So that's where the service file comes in. And so let's take that code that we could possibly reuse and let's put it in the contract service file. And so from there, we are able to then, in the next slide, see that now all of a sudden that endpoint is just the contract service method or function that we have right there from the service file. So now, if I want to reuse this code again, I just import the service file from the constructor and return whatever method that's already in that service file. So you can see it's really clean. It's easier to maintain. I don't have to worry about the logic as far as like, I write it once, I can use it anywhere, right? All right, so that was just a basic overview of NestJS, what it can do. So now some of the things that we had to think about as far as how we're going to automate Bob's CRM, how we're going to automate things to work without us someone having to make a request and all that, right? So for all intents and purposes, Bob CRM has an API that we will connect to our Nest server, and it will send contracts to our Mongo instance. That part is already done. All we do is, that really will be the only human interaction, right? Someone writes a form down, fills a form out, and ships it to Bob's CRM. That API connects to our NestJS server, and then goes to our MongoDB. Now, the other three things, the database listener, the cron scheduling, and the queue service, those are things that will happen that will essentially replace some of those touch points that we were talking about earlier. And so this is an example of making a post request that sends the data to our MongoDB instance. And so right there, you can see that automatically right here, this line over here that says emitting event. So this event emitter.emit contract was created. It's kind of like a queuing service that you can also use to trigger the start of your automation. Okay. Let's see. Now, if I'm gonna listen to the database, this is a really cool thing. I thought this was awesome. Is you can actually open up I don't know, I want to say underneath the hood, it's a socket or some kind of open connection that the server will be listening to the database for specific functionality. So if it's in MongoDB specifically, it's the insert. So that was the C of the CRUD operations. I was like, okay, whenever that happens, whenever something is created in MongoDB, whenever a contract comes in, then all this other stuff happens. And that's really cool because then on startup, you could, like at the start of the server, you could have this run so that all of a sudden you open up the connection, and when the server spins down, you can close the connection. Really cool stuff. So I actually did this. So whenever a contract would come in, we grabbed it and we did stuff that we had to do. So we added it to a queue in this instance, right? And then it gives in the logger right here, there's an object ID that we could keep a track of our jobs. So the other part is the cron scheduling. So if anyone has heard of cron jobs, it's just things that happen on a schedule. It can be whatever time, whatever day. It's really whatever you want to do. So in this example, there's a runs every 30 seconds. And that's just to handle a database backup, just an example. Now, the next thing is runs every day at 2 a.m. That's there it just logs a daily report. But you could really do things like that. So in the event that you want to, let's say you want to batch update all these contracts, Bob says, hey, let's not mess with a report, or let's generate a report I want to see a report by 8 a.m. the next day. Well, let's just do it when no one is requesting contracts, right? So the most probable time of that would be 2 a.m., right? Somewhere when everyone in the U.S. is sleeping. So we can generate that. And that really is, it's crazy. Like if you test it when you're working with NestJS, you can really see like how it runs on the I think I want to say it's the date object of JavaScript, and it just runs and on cue, right on time. It does whatever you want it to do. That's really cool at that specific time. And so here's an optional controller. I've used it to where you could do a cron job. So this at cron, and then you put your time. And I've done it on a controller. And so it just hits a request. Or it really doesn't, it's in the controller, but you can make it run an asynchronous function. So, but here it's like, oh, you're just getting the crons and you want to get the jobs. So you have that queue system that you will, you can see your jobs and you can see what's happening, what is in process, what failed. Really, right? And not so much what went well; it's what didn't go well. So let's see, and then yeah. So one of the few things that is really, really, really cool is you have NestJS as a server, but then you also use another microservice such as like Redis or Kafka, and you're able to kind of start having this like really cool back and forth between the server and the microservice. And as you're going along and building or running through this process, you can take a history of what's going on and see what's happening between those two services. So, few takeaways. If nothing else, you guys found another JavaScript framework that you can play around with. But really, really cool service. I know if I ever have another project to do that requires runtime JavaScript, I will most likely use NestJS. And so, yeah, thank you so much for coming to my talk, and use NestJS.